"Dad," she began softly, "it's just this wedding. It's such a big deal for his family. It's an image, a tradition." She took a deep breath, and then the words poured out gentle yet painful. "We thought, maybe before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments where you're listening from. The old house on Chestnut Street was never quiet. Not really. Even after 8 years of living alone, if I stood still in the hallway, I could still hear the echoes. I could hear Sarah's laughter bubbling up from the kitchen on a Sunday morning, or the sound of little Jessica's feet no bigger than my palm pattering across the hardwood floors. This house wasn't made of wood and nails. It was made of moments. It was the only real thing of value I had left, and I was about to sell it. It started, as most of life's biggest decisions do, with a promise. I was standing in the living room dusting the framed photo of Sarah on the mantelpiece. Her smile, even in a still image, could warm the entire room. "She's getting married, Sarah," I whispered to the photograph the way I often did. "Our little girl, to a young man named Brad. He's fine. His family has money." I traced the frame with my thumb, a thumb calloused and scarred from 40 years of wrestling with pipes and wrenches. "I am a plumber. It's an honest living. It paid for this house, put food on our table, and sent Jessica to a decent college. It's a good life. But it is not a rich one." When Jessica had come over last week, her eyes sparkling brighter than the diamond on her finger, she was carrying a stack of glossy magazines. She spread them out on the coffee table, the one I had built myself when she was a little girl. The pages were filled with images of fairy tale weddings. Grand ballrooms in historic country clubs, waterfalls of white orchids, and dresses that cost more than my truck. "This is it, Dad," she had said, pointing to a photo of a bride in a sweeping lace gown. "This is my dream." I looked at the picture, then at my daughter's hopeful face, and my heart felt like it was caught in a vice. I saw the price tags discreetly listed in the back of the magazine. They were numbers that lived in a different world than mine. I could give her a nice wedding, a respectable one. A church, a nice dinner at a local hall, a DJ. But I couldn't give her that. I couldn't give her the fairy tale. That night I couldn't sleep. I walked through the quiet rooms of my house, each one a chapter of our life with Sarah. The kitchen where we'd taught Jessica to bake. The backyard where I'd pushed her on the swing. The bedroom where I'd held Sarah's hand until the very end. This house was my sanctuary. It was my last connection to her. But a promise is a promise. I looked back at her photograph on the mantel. Her eyes seemed to be telling me what I already knew. "You'd give her the world, wouldn't you, Frank?" I imagined her saying. "I will, Sarah," I whispered back. "Our little girl. I'll give her the dream we always wanted for her. I promise." The next morning, I called a real estate agent. When I told Jessica that I was selling the house to fund her wedding, she cried tears of joy. She hugged me so tightly, I could barely breathe, telling me I was the best father in the world. And in that moment, watching her eyes light up with a happiness so pure, it seemed to fill the entire room, I truly believed that no price was too high to pay. I had no idea that I was about to learn, in the most brutal way possible, just how wrong I was. There are moments in life that feel like they happened to someone else. You watch your own hand move, watch your own lips form words, but you feel like a spectator sitting in a distant row. Sitting in the sterile air-conditioned office of the real estate agent, Mr. Henderson was one of those moments. He slid a mountain of paperwork across the polished mahogany table. Just sign on the dotted lines, Frank." He said, his voice smooth and practiced. He had the easy smile of a man who didn't deal in homes, but in properties. To him, this was just another transaction, another commission check. To me, it was an amputation. I picked up the pen. It felt impossibly heavy, colder than any steel pipe in the dead of winter. As the tip touched the first line, the ink didn't just flow out. Memories did. Suddenly, I wasn't in an office. I was back in the kitchen on Chestnut Street 20 years ago. Sarah was on a stepladder, a smudge of canary yellow paint on her nose, trying to reach a high corner. She was laughing a sound so full and real it could chase the shadows from any room. "It needs to be happy, Frank," she'd insisted. A kitchen should be the happiest room in the house. I remembered holding the ladder steady, looking up at her, thinking that the happiest room in the house was simply whichever one she was in. My hand trembled slightly. "Sign here." The pen moved again. Now I was standing in the hallway, a pencil in my hand, marking little Jessica's height on the door frame. Every year, another line a little higher than the last. "Am I a giant yet, Daddy?" she'd ask, craning her neck to see. I could still feel the phantom weight of her small hand in mine. Those pencil marks were still there, a ladder of memories, climbing up the wood. Mr. Tower Henderson cleared his throat softly, a gentle nudge back to reality. I looked down at the paper. My name, Frank Miller, written in my own clumsy script. A signature. A simple, everyday act that was dismantling my entire world. I pushed the papers back across the table. "It's done," I said, my voice sounding distant. An hour later, my phone buzzed. I opened my banking app. A number stared back at me. A number with so many zeros, it looked like a mistake. It was more money than I had ever seen in one place. The sum total of 40 years of hard work, of saving, of living simply. The value of Sarah's happy kitchen and Jessica's pencil marks on the door frame. It felt like nothing. It felt like dust. I dialed Jessica's number. "Dad, did it go through?" She answered, her voice practically fizzing with excitement. "It did, honey," I said, trying to keep my own voice steady. "The money is in the account. Your account." I could hear her shriek with delight on the other end of the line. "Oh my God, Dad, thank you. Thank you, Brad, and I can finally book the country club and the photographer. I wanted the one who does all the magazine shoots. He's available. Oh, this is going to be perfect, absolutely perfect." She went on, her words a torrent of plans and brand names of deposits and designers. I listened, nodding into the silence of my truck parked across the street from the house that was no longer mine. Each excited word from her was meant to be a balm on my sacrifice, a confirmation that I had done the right thing. But as I hung up the phone, a profound and unsettling quiet settled over me. I had traded a house full of ghosts for a daughter's dream. I told myself it was a fair trade. A father's love, after all, is the only currency that truly matters. But sitting there in the emptiness of my truck, a cold thought crept in uninvited. Even the richest man can be made a fool. Sacrifice is a strange thing. You make a decision, a single clean cut, and you tell yourself the pain is temporary. But the truth is, sacrifice has an echo. It reverberates in the small, quiet moments that follow. For me, the echo sounded like the unfamiliar hum of the refrigerator in my new rented apartment. The place was clean, sterile, and had all the personality of a doctor's waiting room. The walls were a color I could only describe as landlord beige. There were no pencil marks on the door frames here. No ghosts of Sarah's laughter in the kitchen. It was just a place to sleep, a place to wait for my daughter's wedding. Jessica would call every few days, her voice a whirlwind of activity. "Dad, you won't believe it. We secured the Oakwood Country Club. It's going to be stunning," she'd say. I could hear the smile in her voice, and I tried to let it warm me. I knew Oakwood. It was the kind of place where men like me were only allowed in through the service entrance. A week later, it was the dress. "It's a Vera Wang, Dad. A real one, Eleanor, that's Brad's mom," she insisted. She said the wedding pictures are an investment in our future. An investment. I thought of my own wedding to Sarah. We got married at the local courthouse and had a potluck reception in her parents' backyard. Our pictures were taken by her brother with a shaky camera. The total cost probably wouldn't have even paid for the lace on Jessica's sleeve. But it was rich in a way I was starting to realize money couldn't buy. With each phone call, the dream seemed to expand, stretching further and further beyond the simple, beautiful wedding I had imagined. It wasn't just a string quartet anymore. It was a 10-piece band for the reception. It wasn't just flowers. It was orchids, thousands of them, apparently being flown in from somewhere I couldn't pronounce. Eleanor says that for this crowd, you can't just have a cash bar. It would be tacky, Jessica explained one afternoon, a new slightly apologetic tone in her voice. And she thinks we should upgrade the wine selection. The one the venue offers is a bit common. A man who spent his life fixing leaks can spot one from a mile away, and our budget was starting to look like a burst water main. But every time a flicker of doubt entered my mind, I would smother it. I would remember my promise to Sarah. I would remember Jessica's tear-filled eyes when I told her I'd sold the house. This is for her, I'd repeat to myself like a mantra. This is for her. The first real crack in my resolve appeared over something small, trivial even. And for the dessert table, Jessica said, her voice giddy, "Brad's parents are insisting we get the Belgian chocolate fountain. Not the domestic kind, Dad. The Belgian kind." I was silent for a moment. I pictured myself on my knees in some stranger's damp basement, covered in grime, wrestling with a corroded pipe, my back aching. I did that so my daughter could have a fountain of imported chocolate. For the first time, the equation didn't feel right. The sacrifice and the reward suddenly seemed wildly out of balance. "That sounds nice, honey," I managed to say. "Nice, Dad, it's going to be epic," she chirped, oblivious. Eleanor says a wedding is all about the details. It's about creating an experience, an atmosphere of class. Class. That was a word I hadn't heard her use much before. It felt foreign in her mouth, like a word she had borrowed from someone else's vocabulary. I looked down at my own hands, at the dirt permanently etched into the lines of my knuckles. The hands that had paid for the orchids and the string quartet and the fountain of chocolate. I kept telling myself I was paying for my daughter's happiness. But as I sat there in the beige silence of my apartment, a quiet, cold voice in the back of my mind asked a question I couldn't answer. Was I paying for her happiness, or was I simply paying for my own irrelevance? The Oakwood Country Club smelled like old money and fresh-cut grass. Marble floors gleamed under chandeliers that dripped with crystal, and the air was filled with the hushed, confident murmur of people who had never had to check a price tag in their lives. I stood at the entrance to the main dining room, wearing my best suit, the one I'd bought for Sarah's funeral, and felt like a wrench in a box of fine china. Brad's parents, Richard and Eleanor, greeted me with smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. Richard's handshake was firm, a quick, powerful squeeze that was less a greeting and more a statement of dominance. Eleanor's hand was limp and cool in mine, offered as a brief formality before she pulled it away. Frank Richard said, his voice booming, "Good of you to make it." Big night rehearsal for the big day. So, Frank Eleanor began looking me up and down in a single swift glance that seemed to calculate my net worth and find it wanting. "What is it that you do?" "I'm a plumber, ma'am," I said, my voice steady. "I've never been ashamed of my work. My hands have fixed problems, brought water to homes, and provided for my family. They are capable hands." A flicker of something, a change so subtle I might have missed it if I wasn't looking past between them. Eleanor's smile tightened by a fraction of an inch. Richard gave a short, sharp nod as if to say, "That explains it." "Right," he said, and promptly turned to greet a man in a golf shirt. I watched Jessica for the rest of the evening. She moved through the room like a different person, her laughter a little higher, her posture a little straighter. She was performing, trying so hard to fit into the frame of this perfect, wealthy picture. With every polite laugh, with every nod to their inside jokes, I felt her drifting further away from the girl I had raised. The moment came as I knew it would, after the main course. The conversation had turned to the logistics of the ceremony. Jessica, looking nervous, caught my eye and gestured for me to join her by the French doors that led out to the terrace. The air outside was cool. In the distance, the sprinklers on the golf course hissed softly. "Dad." She started, her gaze fixed on a perfectly manicured rose bush. She couldn't look at me. We were all talking, Brad and his parents and I, about the ceremony, about how everything should look. I waited. I knew this wasn't about the flowers. "It's just, this wedding, it's a very big deal for their family. It's an image, you know, a tradition." She took a breath, and then the words came out in a rush, quiet and devastating. "We were thinking, maybe it would be better if Richard walked me down the aisle." Time didn't stop, but it did stretch, each second pulling apart like taffy. I looked at my own hands hanging at my sides. The hands that had held her when she was a baby, that had taught her to tie her shoes, that had patiently fixed her bicycle chain 100 times. The hands that had signed away a home. "Why, Jessie?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. She finally chanced to look at me, and her eyes were full of a terrible mixture of pity and shame. "It's just for the pictures, Dad. The aesthetic. His family. They're all doctors and lawyers. And you're, you know." She winced as she said it, as if the word itself tasted foul. "I'm a plumber," I finished for her. The word just hung there in the cool night air between us. It was no longer a title of my trade. It was an accusation, a label of my inadequacy. I thought she would cry. I thought I would yell. Neither happened. The deep aching hurt inside me didn't erupt into anger. It simply cooled and hardened into something solid and heavy like lead. She started to babble something about how much she loved me, how it didn't really mean anything, how I could still do a father-daughter dance. I didn't hear her. I was looking at her face, the face I knew better than my own, and for the first time, I felt like I was looking at a stranger. A stranger I had just paid a fortune to meet. The daughter I knew was gone. There's a specific kind of pain that comes from a betrayal by your own blood. It's not a sharp, clean wound. It's a slow, crushing pressure, the feeling of your own heart being turned to stone inside your chest. As I stood there on that country club terrace, listening to my daughter try to patch over the gaping hole she had just torn in my soul with flimsy excuses, something inside me shifted. The hurt didn't vanish, but it crystallized. It transformed from a hot liquid grief into something cold, hard, and perfectly clear. For the first time in months, the fog of sentimentality lifted. I wasn't just seeing my little girl anymore. I was seeing a stranger who wore her face, a person so desperate to be accepted by her new wealthy tribe that she was willing to sacrifice her own father on the altar of their approval. She wasn't just disowning me for an evening. She was disowning the 40 years of calloused hands and aching backs that had paid for the very ground she was standing on. I raised a hand and she fell silent, her stream of apologies drying up in her throat. I looked her directly in the eye. For the first time all night, I think she truly saw me. She didn't see a sad old man. She saw the change, the stillness. "It's all right, Jessica," I said, and my voice was calmer than it had been in years. It was the voice I used on the job when a pipe had burst and water was flooding a basement. No panic, just a clear assessment of the damage and the necessary fix. "I understand completely." A flicker of relief crossed her face, but it died when she saw my smile. It wasn't a warm smile. It wasn't a forgiving one. It was the thin, cold smile of a man who had just seen the final move in a game he didn't even know he was playing. "You go on and have your perfect wedding." I continued, my voice still quiet. "Don't you worry about me. And don't you worry about a thing." I paused, letting the words hang in the cool air. "I'll still be sending you that wedding gift. A very special one. I promise you, it's something neither of you will ever forget." Before she could process that, I turned and walked away. I didn't look back. I walked through the opulent room past the tables of laughing, wealthy strangers. I walked past Richard and Eleanor, who were holding court by the bar, and gave them a brief, unreadable nod. I walked out the grand entrance, leaving the sound of the string quartet and the smell of money behind me. I didn't stop until I was sitting in the driver's seat of my old Ford truck. The familiar scent of worn leather and motor oil felt more honest, more real than anything in that clubhouse. The truck was a testament to my life's work. It, like my hands, had served me faithfully. For a long moment I just sat there in the silence, the engine off. The man who had walked into that rehearsal dinner was gone. He had died on that terrace, slain by his own daughter's shame. In his place sat someone else. Someone colder, perhaps, but someone who finally understood the true value of things. My hands, my calloused, grease-stained plumber's hands, felt steady as I pulled out my phone. I scrolled through my contacts past Jessica's name and stopped on a number I had saved only a few weeks ago. I pressed the call button. It rang twice. "Law offices of Catherine Davis," a professional voice answered. "Hello, Ms. Davis," I said, my gaze fixed on the distant glittering lights of the country club. "This is Frank Miller. We spoke last week about the trust fund for my daughter's wedding." "Yes, Mr. Miller. How can I help you?" "I need to make a change," I said, my voice as firm and solid as steel. "A change to the delivery instructions for the gift. And there are two kinds of strength in this world. There's the strength you use to build things up and the strength you need to tear them down. For 40 years, I had only ever known the first kind. The next morning, sitting in the quiet, wood-paneled office of Catherine Davis, I learned about the second. Her office was on the 12th floor of a downtown building with a wide window that looked out over the entire city. It was a place of order and consequence, a place where emotions were translated into contracts and pain was distilled into legal precedent. It felt a world away from the grease and grime of my daily life. But for the first time, I didn't feel out of place. I felt like I was exactly where I needed to be. Ms. Davis was a woman in her 50s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She didn't offer condolences or pity. She offered competence. She motioned for me to sit, folded her hands on her large oak desk, and got straight to the point. "Mr. Miller," she began, her voice calm and professional. Your call last night was unexpected. My instructions were to have a certified check for $150,000 delivered to the wedding coordinator at the Oakwood Country Club tomorrow morning. You indicated that is no longer the plan. That is correct, I said, my voice even. The funds are no longer a gift to be delivered. They are a message to be delivered. She leaned back in her leather chair, her expression unreadable. Go on. I want you to attend the ceremony tomorrow, not as a guest, as my legal representative. I slid a piece of paper across the desk. It was the wedding invitation with the time of the ceremony circled in red. At the point where the officiant asks if anyone objects to the union, I want you to stand up. Her eyebrows raised just slightly. And object? No, I said. That would be a lie. I don't object to the marriage. I object to the price of admission. You will not object. You will simply state that you have an announcement to make on behalf of the father of the bride regarding his wedding gift. A slow, calculating smile began to form on her lips. I see. You want a public declaration. I want a public accounting, I corrected her. You will announce that the gift of $150,000 has been rescinded effective immediately. And you will state very clearly that as a result, none of the contracts for the venue, the catering, the flowers, or any other service for this event have been paid. For a long moment she was silent, simply studying my face. I didn't flinch. The heartbroken man from the night before was gone. In his place was a client with a clear set of instructions. This will cause a considerable scene, Mr. Miller, she said, finally. Not as a warning, but as a statement of fact. That is the intention, I replied. She nodded, then leaned forward, a new glint of admiration in her eyes. And the funds themselves? What should I do with the $150,000 once the stop payment is confirmed? I pushed 2 more pieces of paper across the desk. The first was the address of my old house on Chestnut Street. The second was the address of a luxury apartment building downtown. I understand the real estate agent for my old house accepted an offer yesterday, but the sale hasn't closed. I want you to make a cash offer for $10,000 over the asking price. I want my house back, I said. And as for the second address, I've learned my daughter and her fiancé are renting the penthouse apartment. I want you to find out who owns the building and make them an offer they can't refuse. I want to buy it. Catherine Davis stared at the papers, then back at me. The professional smile was gone, replaced by one of genuine, unrestrained awe. She leaned back and let out a low whistle. Mr. Miller, she said, shaking her head slowly. I have handled bitter divorces, hostile corporate takeovers, and inheritance disputes that have torn families apart for generations. She picked up her pen. But this is not a lawsuit. This is a masterpiece. We shook hands on it. Her grip was firm, a handshake between equals. As I walked out of her office and into the bright morning sun, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. Sarah had always been the one who believed in grace and forgiveness. But I was learning that some lessons can't be taught with grace. Sometimes, before there can be any hope of forgiveness, there must first be an accounting. And the bill for my daughter's dream wedding was about to come due. The morning of my daughter's wedding, I did not wake up in a fancy hotel suite. I woke up in my small beige apartment. I did not put on a tuxedo. I put on my worn-in jeans and a flannel shirt. And I did not go to the Oakwood Country Club. I went to a place called the Corner Booth, a little diner I'd been going to for 30 years. A place where the coffee is strong and the waitresses know your name. I sat in my usual booth, the one with the small tear in the red vinyl, and watched the world go by outside the window. It was a beautiful day. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. a perfect day for a wedding. My phone was on the table beside my coffee cup, screen down. It had buzzed a few times earlier, but I hadn't looked. I knew who it was. Jessica, probably. Or maybe Brad. Wondering why I wasn't there for the pre-ceremony photographs. It was a small, insignificant tether to the chaos I knew was unfolding across town, and I had no desire to pull on it. Instead, I took a slow sip of my coffee and pictured the scene. I could see it as clearly as if I were there. The bridal suite at Oakwood, a flurry of silk hairspray and frantic energy. The pop of a champagne cork, the nervous laughter of bridesmaids. Jessica would be sitting in a high-backed chair in front of a mirror, surrounded by lights, a team of strangers fussing over her hair and makeup, transforming her into the princess from the magazines. She would be a queen, for a day the center of her own universe, completely unaware that her kingdom was built on a foundation of lies and that the ground was already beginning to crumble beneath her feet. I imagined her waving away a concerned bridesmaid who mentioned the florist had called again, saying something like, "Oh, Dad will handle it. He's taking care of everything." The irony was so thick I could almost taste it in my coffee. I was taking care of everything, just not in the way she imagined. A young couple came into the diner and slid into the booth across from me, their hands clasped together on the tabletop. Their eyes full of the easy, gentle love that doesn't need a country club or imported orchids to be real. They reminded me of Sarah and me so many years ago. I thought of my promise to her. Was this what she would have wanted? This grand, hollow spectacle, a wedding where her husband was deemed too embarrassing to walk their own daughter down the aisle? No. Sarah valued honesty above all else. She valued substance over style. The wedding that was about to take place wasn't an honor to her memory. It was a betrayal of everything we had built together. My actions today weren't about revenge on Jessica. They were about protecting the sanctity of what was real. I looked at my watch. 10:45 a.m. The ceremony was scheduled for 11. Ms. Davis would be arriving soon. I finished my coffee, left a $20 bill on the table for a $3 breakfast, and walked out into the bright sunshine. I got into my truck, the engine turning over with a familiar, comforting rumble. I didn't drive away. I just sat there, my hands on the steering wheel, and watched the second hand on my watch tick steadily onward. In 15 minutes, Jessica would begin her walk down the aisle to start her perfect new life. She had no idea that the aisle was leading directly off a cliff, and I was the one who had calmly, deliberately, and with a father's broken heart, removed the bridge. In my line of work, you learn that every system, no matter how complex, has a breaking point. A house's plumbing is a network of trust. You trust that the pipes will hold, that the pressure will remain steady, that water will flow where it's supposed to. A wedding, I was beginning to realize, is much the same. It's a system built on promises and payments. And I had just turned off the main valve. Sitting in my truck, a safe distance from the manicured perfection of the country club, I could picture the first signs of the leak. It wouldn't be a flood, not at first. It would start as a trickle of panic. The first call, I imagined, would be from the florist. A man named Peterson, a small business owner like me. He'd be standing by his refrigerated truck filled with $10,000 worth of delicate imported orchids. He'd call Jessica's phone. A bridesmaid, annoyed at the interruption, would answer with a sharp, "She's getting her makeup done." Peterson, a man with bills of his own to pay, would persist. He'd call Brad. I could almost hear Brad's arrogant, dismissive tone. "It's all been handled? Her father's covering it." A click. End of conversation. But the seed of doubt would have been planted in Mr. Peterson's mind. The next call would be more serious. It would come from the venue manager, a man named Harrison, whose entire career was built on smooth, seamless events. He would not be so easily dismissed. He wouldn't bother with the children. He would go straight to the man writing the checks, or so he thought. He would find Richard Brad's father schmoozing by the lobster and shrimp ice sculpture. Richard, a word Harrison would say, his smile tight and professional. A small administrative detail. The final payment for today's event, which was due Tuesday, has not yet been processed. The initial deposit check also appears not to have cleared the bank. I could picture the flush of crimson rising on Richard's neck. The public embarrassment in his own territory in front of his peers. He'd pull out his wallet, a sleek piece of alligator skin, and produce a platinum credit card. Just put it on this. And Harrison would give a regretful little shake of his head. I'm sorry, Richard, but for an event of this magnitude, our policy requires certified funds. Besides, the amount far exceeds our single transaction limit. That would be the moment the trickle became a steady stream. Brad would be summoned. I could see him, his perfect tuxedo, suddenly feeling too tight. His face losing its confident swagger. He'd burst into the bridal suite, his voice a harsh whisper. Jess, what the hell is going on? Harrison just cornered my father. He says nothing's been paid for. Nothing. Where is your dad? And Jessica, my beautiful daughter, a princess surrounded by her court, would look up from the mirror, her face a mask of confusion and annoyance. What are you talking about? He said he was handling it. He always handles it. They were children. Children who had been playing with a dollhouse their whole lives, never once wondering who paid the mortgage on it. And the bill had just been slipped under the door. I felt a grim sense of justice, but no joy. There was a sour taste in my mouth as I thought of Peterson and his truck full of wilting flowers. My fight was not with him. It was with the people who believed his hard work and mine could be commanded and then forgotten. I looked at the clock on my dashboard. 11:00 a.m. Showtime. I knew they would proceed. Their pride would demand it. They would walk down that aisle, smiling for the cameras, putting on the grand performance, all while frantically praying that the plumber would show up at the last second to fix everything. But this was one problem I had no intention of fixing. I had been the one to loosen the joint, to apply the pressure to start the leak. And I was patiently waiting for the whole pipe to burst. There is a piece of music they always play at weddings. A hopeful climbing melody played on a cello that seems to promise that all endings can be beautiful beginnings. Pachelbel's Canon. As I sat in my truck, the engine silent, I could hear it playing in my head. I had paid for the string quartet that was performing it. Another detail on a long, itemized list of my own erasure. In my mind's eye, I saw the scene unfold. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom at the Oakwood Country Club would swing open. The guests, 150 souls adrift in a sea of unspoken tension, would rise to their feet, their faces a mixture of polite curiosity and nervous anticipation. At the far end of the aisle, Brad would be standing trying to project an image of the confident, loving groom. But I knew him. I could picture the slight tremor in his hand, the way his smile wouldn't quite reach his eyes. He wouldn't be looking for his bride. He would be scanning the back of the room, looking for me, looking for his bailout. The procession would begin. Bridesmaids in pastel dresses, their smiles as stiff and fragile as sponge sugar. Groomsmen in rented tuxedos shifting uncomfortably on their feet. They all knew something was wrong. The air, which should have been thick with joy, was choked with the suffocating weight of unpaid bills and unanswered phone calls. And then the music would swell. The crescendo. The main event. Jessica, my daughter, would appear at the doorway, a vision in white lace and silk. A princess in a gown that had cost more than my first 2 years of mortgage payments combined. And for a heartbreaking second, the anger in my chest would dissolve, replaced by that old familiar ache of a father's love. That was still my little girl, my Jessie. But she wasn't on my arm. She was holding onto the arm of Richard Brad's father. He would be beaming, his chest puffed out, playing the part of the proud patriarch, the lord of the manor. He would walk her down that aisle, not as a father giving away a daughter, but as a king sealing an alliance. It wasn't a transfer of trust. It was a corporate merger. And I was the asset that had been liquidated to fund it. I imagined them reaching the altar. I imagined the officiant, a man with a kind face, smiling at them, completely unaware of the rot beneath the beautiful surface. He would begin to speak of the sacred vows, of love, honor, and trust, of family. I wondered what Jessica would be thinking standing there. Was she thinking of a lifetime with the man beside her? Or was she thinking about the angry florist? Was she listening to the vows, or was she listening for the sound of my footsteps at the door? The ceremony would progress, a flawless performance of a hollow script. They would exchange rings. They would smile for the photographer. They would hold hands, a perfect picture of devotion. And then would come the moment, the final, terrible, beautiful moment of truth. The officiant would clear his throat, smile out at the silent guests, and ask the timeless question. If there is anyone present who has just cause for why this couple should not be joined in holy matrimony, speak now or forever hold your peace. I leaned my head back against the worn headrest of my truck. A deep, steady breath. This was it. The officiant smiled, blissfully unaware. He thought he was asking a question. He was actually giving a cue. In the life of every parent, there is a moment you must let go. You watch your child walk away from you towards their own life, and a piece of your heart goes with them. I had always imagined that moment would be on Jessica's wedding day, as I placed her hand in her husband's, a bittersweet farewell, filled with love and hope. I never imagined it would be like this. I had let go, yes, but it was not a release. It was a severance. In my mind's eye, I saw the scene with perfect crystalline clarity. The officiant's benign question, "Speak now or forever hold your peace," lingered in the air of the grand ballroom. A beat of silence. 2. Jessica and Brad would have exchanged a fleeting, relieved smile. They had made it. The financial crisis had been averted somehow. They were safe. And then a sound. It wouldn't have been loud. Just a soft, authoritative swoosh as the grand oak doors at the back of the room swung inward. Every head in the room would have turned. 150 pairs of eyes, all drawn to the figure standing, silhouetted in the doorway. It was not me. The guests would have been expecting a disheveled, angry father. Instead, they saw a woman. She was tall, poised, and dressed not in the celebratory pastels of a wedding guest, but in a sharply tailored navy blue business suit. She held a leather briefcase in one hand. She did not belong. And that in itself was a statement. She was an anomaly, a disruption to their carefully curated world. A wave of murmurs would have rippled through the crowd. I could picture Richard Brad's father stiffening with indignation. He'd probably take a half step forward, ready to signal for security to have this intruder removed. Jessica's face would be a canvas of pure confusion. Brad's would be a mask of dawning horror. The woman in the blue suit did not remain in the doorway. With a steady, unhurried gait, She began to walk down the center aisle. The click of her heels on the marble floor was the only sound in the cavernous room, a metronome counting down to disaster. She walked with the unshakable confidence of someone who knew she held all the cards. She stopped about 3 rows from the front, turning slightly, so that she was addressing not just the wedding party, but the entire assembly. She waited for the whispers to die her presence alone, commanding the silence. When she spoke, her voice wasn't loud, but it was clear, crisp, and carried the undeniable weight of authority. "Please forgive the intrusion." She would begin, her gaze sweeping across the room before settling on the altar. "My name is Catherine Davis." She paused, letting them absorb that. "I am here today as legal counsel representing Mr. Frank Miller, the father of the bride." I imagined the effect that name would have in that room. My name, the plumber's name, the name of the man they had deemed an embarrassment, the one they had written out of their perfect script. It would have landed not like a word, but like a stone dropped into a still silent pond. The name of the ghost they thought they had banished had just arrived to haunt the feast. And my architect of justice was about to read the verdict. In plumbing, there's a phenomenon called a water hammer. It's what happens when you shut off the flow of water too quickly. The momentum of the water with nowhere to go creates a massive pressure shock, a loud, violent bang that shakes the entire system to its core. As Ms. Davis stood in the center of that silent ballroom, I imagined the water hammer that was about to hit. Richard Sterling Brad's father was the first to recover. His face was a mask of thunderous disbelief. "This is outrageous," he boomed, his voice accustomed to commanding boardrooms, not being challenged at family weddings. "This is a private celebration. Whatever this is about, it can wait." "Security?" Ms. Davis didn't even flinch. She simply turned her cool gaze on him. "On the contrary, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice cutting through his bluster like a diamond cuts glass. "My client, Mr. Miller, felt it was of the utmost importance that this announcement be made now in front of all the parties who have gathered to celebrate. It directly concerns his wedding gift to the bride and groom." The word gift hung in the air, a beautiful, fragile thing. For a fleeting second, I pictured a flicker of hope in Jessica's eyes. Maybe this was it. Maybe this was the grand gesture, the loving surprise. Miss Davis let the silence stretch for a moment, ensuring she had the undivided attention of every single person in the room. Then she began. "Mr. Frank Miller." She stated, her tone factual and devoid of emotion, had arranged to provide his daughter Jessica and his son-in-law Brad with a wedding gift in the form of a certified fund totaling $150,000 intended to cover the full expenses of today's event. A soft, collective sigh of relief seemed to pass through the guests. Richard Sterling relaxed his shoulders slightly. The crisis was over. The plumber had come through. However, Ms. Davis continued, and that single word changed the entire atmosphere of the room. Due to certain recent and unfortunate developments regarding the conditions of this gift, Mr. Miller has instructed me as his legal counsel to inform you that this gift has been officially and irrevocably rescinded as of 9:00 a.m. this morning. If her first announcement was a stone dropped in a pond, this one was a boulder. A collective gasp went through the room. But she wasn't finished. She let her gaze drift for a moment over the waterfalls of imported orchids, past the anxious-looking string quartet towards the catering staff who were now frozen by the service doors. "For the sake of complete clarity," she said, her voice projecting to every corner of the silent, stunned room. "What this means is that the payment intended for the Oakwood Country Club was never delivered. Therefore, All vendor contracts for today's celebration, including the floral arrangements, the 10-piece band, the 5-course meal, the photography and videography services, and of course the rental of this ballroom itself, are currently outstanding and unpaid. It was a symphony of chaos. The murmurs exploded into audible frantic chatter. I could picture the look of pure panic on the vendors' faces. I saw Eleanor Sterling's hand fly to her chest, her face a perfect mask of public humiliation. I saw Richard's face turn from red to a shade of purple I hadn't seen before. I saw Brad turn to my daughter, his face no longer filled with love, but with a raw, ugly fury. But most of all, I saw Jessica. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just wilted. The color drained from her face, leaving her as white as her designer gown. Her shoulders, which had been so straight and proud, slumped forward. She finally understood. She understood the cold smile. She understood the phone call. She understood her father's special gift. A gift is given freely out of love. A payment is exchanged for services rendered. They had treated my sacrifice like a transaction, my love like a line of credit. I hadn't taken back a gift. I had simply canceled a payment for services I was no longer receiving, the service of being treated like family. The performance was over. The lights had just gone out, and everyone was left standing in the dark. A controlled demolition is a fascinating thing to watch. For a moment, the building stands tall, proud, seemingly untouched. Then, with a series of deep internal rumbles, its foundations give way, and it collapses in on itself in a cloud of dust and regret. From the safety of my truck parked miles away, I pictured the demolition I had just engineered. Ms. Davis would not have stayed. Her work was done. She would have delivered the final devastating sentence, given a slight professional nod, and walked out the same way she came in, leaving a crater of pure social chaos in her wake. The first sound to break the stunned silence would have been the low, angry hum of the guests, whispers turning into frantic, excited gossip. Phones would have been raised not to take pictures of the happy couple, but to record the beautiful disaster. In that room, my daughter and her new husband were no longer a bride and groom. They were a spectacle. Then the vendors would descend. I pictured Mr. Maj Harrison, the venue manager, his professional veneer cracked, striding over to Richard Sterling, his face a thundercloud. I imagined the caterer, the musicians, the photographer, all good people trying to make an honest living surrounding the wedding party. Like sharks that had smelled blood in the water, all demanding to know who was going to pay for this mountain of unpaid bills. But the real demolition would be happening at the center, at the altar. The blame would have begun its vicious circular dance. Richard and Eleanor, their faces contorted with a fury born of public humiliation, would turn on their son. "How could you let this happen, Brad?" I could hear Richard's voice in my head. "You associate our family name with this white trash. You've made us a laughingstock," and Brad, weak and spineless, would deflect that fury onto the easiest target. He would turn to Jessica. The man who had moments before promised to love and cherish her would look at her with nothing but contempt. "This is your fault," he'd hiss, his voice low and venomous. "Your pathetic, embarrassing plumber of a father. You and your entire broken family." And Jessica, my daughter, the princess in the Vera Wang gown. She would be standing in the middle of it all, the epicenter of the earthquake, being battered by all sides. The beautiful, expensive dream she had demanded, the one she had sold her own father for, had become a nightmare. And she was the only one trapped inside it. I didn't feel joy in picturing her pain. I truly didn't. I just felt a profound, aching sadness. I saw the melting ice sculpture of two swans dripping its transient beauty onto the polished marble floor, a perfect silent metaphor for their union. I saw the 5-course meal untouched being wheeled away. I saw the guests fleeing as if from a burning building, shaking their heads, eager to spread the story. Jessica had wanted a dream. I had given her the money for one. But dreams, I reflected, are not real. They are delicate, fragile things spun from hope and moonlight. Her dream wasn't made of hope. It was built with my sacrifice and held together by her shame. It was a hollow thing. I hadn't destroyed her dream. I had simply turned on the lights. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I put the key in the ignition and turned it. The engine of my old truck rumbled to life, a steady, dependable sound in a world that had just been shattered. I wasn't driving away from the chaos. I was driving towards what came next, towards what was real. A dream had died today, an expensive, hollow dream, and in the quiet space it left behind something new was beginning to grow. It felt a lot like peace. A man's home is more than just a shelter. It's a silent witness to his life. It holds the echoes of laughter, absorbs the tears of sorrow, and keeps a quiet tally of the years and the scuffs on its floors and the fading of its paint. When I sold my house on Chestnut Street, I didn't just sell a building. I sold the witness. As I drove away from the diner, I didn't head back to the sterile beige apartment. I drove through the familiar tree-lined streets of my old neighborhood. I took a right onto Chestnut Street. And there it was. My house. It looked the same, a sturdy, honest house, with a porch Sarah had always loved. But there was a difference. The red for sale sign that had been a spear in my heart for weeks now had a bold, beautiful banner slapped across it. Sold. I pulled my truck over to the curb and got out. The air here smelled different. It smelled like home. I reached into my pocket, my fingers bypassing the old worn set of keys out of habit, and closed around a new set. They were shiny and sharp, the teeth freshly cut. The keys to my own life. I walked up the familiar concrete path, my footsteps sounding a rhythm I knew by heart. The key slid into the lock with a satisfying, solid click. The door swung open. The house was empty. The new owners hadn't moved in yet, because of course there were no new owners. The rooms were hollow and vast, without our furniture, and my footsteps echoed in the stillness. But it wasn't empty. Not at all. I walked into the living room. My eyes went to the spot on the wall where the television used to be, where Sarah and I would watch old movies on a Friday night, her feet tucked under my legs. I could almost feel the phantom weight of the old sofa cushions as I imagined sitting there. In the kitchen, I ran my hand over the canary yellow wall. It needed a new coat of paint, but it was still the happiest room in the house. I stopped in the hallway at the door frame leading to what was once Jessica's room. There they were, the pencil marks. A ladder of lines reaching for the ceiling, each one dated in Sarah's neat handwriting. Jessie, age 6. Jessie, age 10. Jessie, age 17. I touched the highest mark, the one from just before she left for college. Where did that girl go? The girl who was so proud of every new inch. Who would stand on her tiptoes trying to be bigger, trying to reach for the future. Had this always been the future she was reaching for? A future where her father's love was measured in dollars and his presence was a liability. A deep, profound sense of peace settled over me. It wasn't the fiery satisfaction of revenge. It was a quieter, stronger feeling. The feeling of restoration. They had wanted a wedding that would buy them a new life, a new social standing. They had used the foundation of my life with Sarah as their down payment. So I had taken their currency, the cold, hard cash, and I had bought back my foundation. I had bought back my memories. I had bought back my home. Standing there in the sun-drenched silence of my empty living room, I felt more whole than I had in years. I was home. But my work was not yet finished. There was one more property that now required my attention. The world is full of different kinds of homes. There are the ones built of wood and nails, filled with memories. And then there are the ones built of glass and steel, filled with ambition. My house on Chestnut Street was the first kind. The penthouse apartment my daughter and her new husband lived in was the second. I could picture their retreat from the battlefield at the country club. A long, silent drive in Brad's expensive sports car, the silence thick with blame and humiliation. The beautiful $5,000 wedding gown, now feeling less like a symbol of a new beginning and more like a costume from a failed play. They would have fled to their sanctuary, their gleaming tower of glass, in the heart of the city. A place called the Grandview Lofts. A name that promised a certain kind of life, a life lived above the rest of the world. They would have been desperate to get inside, to lock the door, and shut out the disaster they had created. And that's where they would have found it. It wouldn't have been obvious. Just a plain manila envelope taped neatly to the solid oak door of their penthouse. Not slipped under the door, but placed directly at eye level. A statement. Brad, I imagine, would have ripped it from the door, his hands shaking with fury, probably assuming it was another bill, another demand from a vendor. Jessica would have stood behind him, her body numb with shock, dreading what new horror awaited. Inside, there would be no angry letter. There would be no emotional appeal. My time for emotion was over. There would only be a single cold, professionally typed sheet of paper. At the top in bold letters, it would read, "Official Notice of Tenancy Termination." The document would be brief and brutal in its clarity. It would state that as of 10:00 a.m. that morning, the ownership of the Grandview Lofts building had been legally transferred to a new holding company, Chestnut Street Properties, LLC. It would go on to inform them, in accordance with state law, that their current month-to-month rental agreement was being terminated by the new ownership. They would have 30 days to vacate the premises. And then at the very bottom next to the line for the signature of the sole proprietor of Chestnut Street Properties, LLC, they would see a name. A name written in the same steady, deliberate script that had signed away a home to fund their dream. My name. Frank Miller. That would be the moment the ground truly fell away from beneath them. It was one thing to have the wedding money taken back. It was another thing entirely to realize that the very roof over their heads, the ultimate symbol of their sophisticated, independent life, was just another one of their father's assets. Their sanctuary was not a sanctuary. Their castle was, in fact, my property. They hadn't just been disinvited from my life. They were now being evicted from it. Back in my own house, the real house on Chestnut Street, I walked over to the window and looked out at the setting sun. A home, I thought, like a marriage or a life, is only as strong as its foundation. They had built their life together on a foundation of my money and their lies. I didn't destroy their home. I simply revealed the rotten ground it had been built upon. And a house built on sand cannot stand. A home is a place you can always return to. For days after the wedding, I worked on mine. I sanded the old floorboards until the grain shone through, patched the tiny holes in the walls, and felt the quiet satisfaction of mending things with my own 2 hands. I was restoring the house, and in doing so, I was restoring myself. Then one afternoon, there was a knock on the door. I didn't need to look through the peephole. I knew. I opened the door, and there she was. Jessica. But it was a version of her I hadn't seen in years. The princess from the country club was gone. In her place stood a girl who looked lost and painfully young. Her hair was unkempt, her eyes were red and swollen from days of crying, and the designer clothes had been replaced by a simple worn-out sweatshirt. She looked like the college freshman I had dropped off at her dorm when I am all those years ago, terrified and alone. "Dad," she whispered, her voice cracking. The word was a fragile prayer. I didn't speak. I simply stepped aside and let her in. She walked into the middle of the empty living room and stood there looking small and broken amidst the vast, echoing space. And then the dam broke. "I'm so sorry, Dad," she sobbed, the words tumbling out between gasps. "I was so stupid, so awful. I don't know what I was thinking. Brad left me. He packed his bags the next day. His parents blame me for everything. They won't even take my calls. We lost the apartment, Dad. We lost everything." She looked up at me, her face a mess of tears and desperation. "Please, Dad. You have to help me. You can fix this. You always fix everything." I listened until she had cried herself out, until all that was left was the sound of her ragged breathing in the quiet room. The old Frank, the man who existed only a week ago, would have rushed to hold her. He would have promised to make it all better. But that man was gone. "The apartment, Jessie," I said finally, my voice softer than I expected. "The money, that's not what you lost. You lost something much, much more valuable." I walked over to the door frame, the one with the pencil marks. I would have spent the rest of my life on my knees, fixing pipes in the dark, just to see you happy. I sold this house, our house, your mother's sanctuary, and the only thing that made it bearable was the belief that I was buying your joy. I turned to face her, but it wasn't joy I was buying, was it? It was a ticket of admission into their world, and the price of that ticket was me. You wanted my money, but you were ashamed of my presence. You were ashamed of the very hands that earned it. You didn't want your father to walk you down the aisle. You wanted a sponsor, a silent benefactor to fund the illusion. "I'm sorry," she whispered again, her voice pleading. "Fix it, please." "I can't fix this," I said, and the words were heavy, with a sad finality. "Because I'm not the one who broke it. You did. You broke it the moment you decided my love was worth less than their approval." She looked at me, the last flicker of hope dying in her eyes. "So this is it. You're just throwing me away." I walked over to her then, and for the first time, I looked at her not as a problem to be solved, but as the daughter I still loved despite the wreckage between us. "I will never throw you away, Jessica. I will always be your father, and I will always love the little girl who made those marks on the door frame." I paused, letting the truth of that settle. "But I will not be your bank account. I will not be your doormat. A family is a two-way street. You closed your side of the street to me that night on the terrace." I looked into her tear-filled eyes. "If you ever want a relationship with me again, you will be the one who has to rebuild it. You will lay every brick yourself with respect and with honesty. And if you can't do that, then we will have nothing but this empty room between us. She stared at me, finally understanding. There were no more tears to cry, no more deals to be made. She had met a boundary that was not for sale. I knew her road ahead would be a long and difficult one. But some lessons in this life have to be learned by walking, not by being carried. And my days of carrying her were over. Life, much like the houses I work on, has its own seasons. There are seasons for building seasons, for enduring storms, and seasons for quiet repair. The autumn that followed the disastrous summer wedding was a season of repair for me. The house on Chestnut Street slowly began to feel like home again. Not the same home it was. With Sarah, nothing could ever be the same. But something new. Something mine. I didn't fill the empty rooms with expensive furniture. I filled them with myself. I built a new bookshelf in the living room, its wood still smelling of sawdust and varnish. I planted a small vegetable garden in the backyard, my hands finding a familiar comfort in the rich soil. The house was no longer a museum of memories I was afraid to lose. It had become a workshop for the life I was building now. I still worked. My truck still rumbled to life before dawn. My hands still got dirty fixing the problems of others. But something had changed. The shame my daughter had tried to place on my profession was gone, replaced by a quiet, solid pride. My work was honest. My life was my own. It was a foundation no one could take from me. I heard whispers of Jessica's new life. Not from her, she kept her distance, respecting the boundary I had drawn. I heard from a cousin that she was working 2 jobs, one as a waitress in a diner, much like the one I frequented, and another in retail. She was living in a tiny studio apartment across town, paying off the debts from her one-day fairy tale. I felt a pang of sadness for her struggle, but it was overshadowed by a flicker of respect. For the first time, she was building something of her own, with her own 2 hands. Perhaps one day she would understand the value of it. As for Brad and the Sterlings, their names faded from the city's society pages. Humiliation, I've learned, is a stain that is hard to wash out when your entire life is built on the pristine surface of reputation. They were a storm that had passed, leaving my sky clearer than it had been before. One Saturday afternoon, I was on my porch, sanding down an old rocking chair I'd found when my phone rang. I didn't tense up. I didn't brace for impact. I looked at the screen and smiled. It was my friend Charlie, another contractor. "Hey, Frank," he said, his voice cheerful. "The fish are biting down at the lake. You in?" "I'm in, Charlie," I said without a moment's hesitation. "I'll be there in an hour." As I hung up, I looked at my house, solid and peaceful in the afternoon sun. I looked at my hands, calloused and capable, and I thought of the long journey it had taken to get back to this simple, quiet moment of peace. Love, I realized, is not a blank check. You cannot keep withdrawing from it without making a deposit. It is a foundation. And like any foundation, it must be built on the solid, level ground of mutual respect. Anything else is just a house of cards built for show and destined to collapse at the slightest tremor. My house was strong again. Its foundation was settled. And I was, for the first time in a very long time, truly and completely at peace. Thank you for joining us on Frank's journey. We tell these stories because we believe every family has powerful lessons to teach. What are your thoughts on Frank's final decision? Is there a line where sacrifice must end and self-respect must begin? We would be honored to read your perspective in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It allows us to continue bringing these important stories to light. To listen to our next story, simply click on the video that has appeared on your screen. Until next time, be kind to one another and cherish the foundations you build your life upon.